name is Peter Hewitt from Pan's Carnivores. Most people call me Pan. In today's segment, what we're going to show you is how to take a Nepenthes or a tropical pitcher plant cutting. If you want to propagate your plants that come a little leggy perhaps, or if you just want to propagate your plants, we will go and show you how to do that. Okay, what we usually would do is we find a plant that's become a little bit leggy or tall. Some of them we want to become tall and we'll stake those plants, but some of them become a little bit messy and we want to take cuttings off those ones. So we've chosen a nice Nepenthes Captain Hook, and we're going to take our cuttings from this plant. Generally, you can take cuttings at any time of the year, with Nepenthes being tropical plants, but it's probably better to do it in the spring or the summertime when it's warm, because Nepenthes really do resent the cold. So it's very hard to root them when it's cold. Now, of course, before we want to take a cutting from any plant, we want to make sure that there are certain characteristics present on the plant before you take your cutting. You want to make sure that your plant has a small basal shoot at the base of the plant, which the plants will usually have produced several of them by the time the plant gets to this kind of length. But as soon as your plant starts to vine, it'll make a little baby plant at the side of it, and from that point onwards, you can start taking cuttings from the main vine. Okay, now before we start our cuttings, we obviously need to get all our goods together. You don't really want to start your cutting process and then have to start looking for the different things that you're going to need to complete the process. So if we get all your things together, and the first thing we're obviously going to need is a container to put our cutting in. I like to use a new pot. It's very difficult to clean old pots of bacteria, etc. If you're going to use a cutting, you want to use something that's new. We're going to use a new blade, we're going to use a new pot, and we're going to use everything as clean as possible so that we don't get infections in our cutting. The potting that we're going to use today is a brown plastic pot. This is a 10 centimeter pot. You can use black pots as well. Any color pot is fine. Most people will tell you not to use a black color pot because they get hot. We've generally found to be a little bit of misinformation. The pots can get hot if they're in the full blazing sun, but your Nepenthes are never going to be in the full blazing sun, so black pots are quite alright. Now obviously we're trying to propagate a plant, and it's quite possible that many of the cuttings, or if we're taking lots of cuttings, not all of them will root, not all of them will be successful. So what we're trying to do is not to use a container that's too large. Of course, we don't want to use a container like this, which is great to grow plants in, but it's not great for cuttings because we're going to use a lot more medium than we actually need to complete the cutting. So just be careful though with Nepenthes, they are quite thick stemmed plants, so we want to go with a pot that's large enough so that your plant can grow out to a decent size in the same pot that you rooted it for a decent amount of time. So you want to go with something like a 10 centimeter pot that we do, like we are doing over here. Action. Now just about any pot is useful. Orchid air pots are pretty good as well. With the media that we use, the cutting will feel just like it is at home. This is how they grow in nature, so it would work just quite as well with a net pot like this. Many orchids are sold in a clear plastic pot like this, and that's also quite alright. Nepenthes are epiphytic plants, so once the roots get going, they actually come to the side of the pot, and the plant will be quite happy with that as well, so it wouldn't be a problem. These are quite effective as pots as well. The next thing we need to talk about is what kind of media you're going to use for your cuttings. Now obviously there are various classes or grades of media that one might use. More expensive medias which will improve your chances of success, and some media that might not be that successful, but if we're taking hundreds of cuttings in a day, sometimes using the premium mixers are a little bit too expensive. At Pan's Carnivores we might be taking up to 500 cuttings in a day of a long bunch of vines, and then we might use a different kind of media to what we would use today. We're going to use, on one of my special plants, we're going to use a different media which is a little bit more of a premium medium. It does increase your chances of success, let's say about 10 to 15% only, but that is, when it comes to cuttings, a significant margin. Okay, now the premium mix that we're going to use today is long fiber sphagnum moss. This one is imported from Chile. Very, very nice stuff. It's very fluffy. It holds a lot of water. You've got to be a little bit careful with this stuff though, is that when you're using it, you must make sure that you squeeze all the excess water out of it. It's very fluffy. It will come to you pre-moistened, so you really must get all the excess moisture out of it. And there, your moss is ready to use. Now we are going to mix it with some other things in order to make it really, really good for your cuttings.
cavitation.
Now, one of the amendments we might use in our mix is something called Perlite. This is expanded silica. It's been put into a hot furnace and basically pops like popcorn, and it makes for a product that is very, very high in aeration. So it basically holds water, but it also has little air pockets in it. So it's very, very good if you're using media that tends to be a little bit wet. It adds a lot of oxygen holding capacity to your medium. So Perlite is a really, really good thing. We will use it in just about any mix that we use with carnivorous plants. Now, if you take quite a few cuttings, and especially if I take cuttings of many plants here, and some of them are very valuable and some of them are not that valuable. They are fairly common plants that I have many of. So then I would definitely use a less than premium mix. It's still very effective, but we would then just use a standard carnivorous plant mix. Okay, and this is what I've got in my hands over here. This is our premium carnivorous plant mix, which is generally for all carnivorous plants, and that is 60% peat moss and 40% perlite. There's one thing that must be said about peat, and unfortunately you probably will not get told this at any retail store that you go to buy any of these goods. You cannot use coco peat with any of carnivorous plants. Coco peat tends to have a little bit of salt buildup in it, and Nepenthes or no carnivorous plants will tolerate it in any condition, so I would not use it. Certain chemicals can be added to coco products to make it usable, but I've found that to be a little bit of a risk. So we never ever use coco products. We always use sphagnum peat and sphagnum long fiber, and those are really the only kinds of moss or peat that are good to use for carnivorous plants. One of the other amendments one might use is vermiculite. It's very popular when taking cuttings, especially for wooded plants. In general, cuttings, any kind of cuttings you might want to take, vermiculite is almost a mainstay. We would use this to mix it with our long fiber sphagnum and perlite mix, probably at a ratio of, when you've got your final mix prepared, you would add another 10% of vermiculite, and that just basically adds a little bit of texture to the medium, and it adds also moisture and air holding capacity, which is very important when you're taking cuttings. You don't want them to be soggy, but you want them to remain moist all the time. Vermiculite is a very good product for that. Okay, there are a couple of things you must do when working with sphagnum, either in peat form or in long fiber form, as we're going to be doing here. Long fiber sphagnum, and most sphagnum is hydrophobic, so it's very difficult to wet it once it's gotten dry. So you must first hydrate your sphagnum. When you get it from bonsai tree, you will get sphagnum that's already been hydrated, so then you need to get the excess water out of it. But when you get long fiber sphagnum that's already been desiccated out, you need to make sure that it is nice and moist. As I mentioned before, when we're growing normal carnivorous plants, we would have a base standard mix, which would be a 60% peat, 40% perlite. Today we're going to be using long fiber sphagnum, as I mentioned earlier, and that mix would be a little bit different. It would be up to 80% long fiber sphagnum and 20% perlite. The reason for that is that long fiber sphagnum has got a lot more air pockets in it, so we really don't need to go too heavily on the perlite. One of the very important things you need to realize when you're taking your Nepenthes cutting is what your plant is going to become later on. We really want the plant, the vine, to carry on growing once it's rooted, but immediately after the plant is rooted, we really want the plant to produce a daughter plant on this side, because the vine will always be a vine. It'll never revert back to a rosetted plant. It'll just carry on growing, and if you just want upper pitches, that's fine, but generally we want our plants to have lower pitches on them. So there's a very particular way you have to go about it if you want that to happen. Now you'll note on a Nepenthes stem, above each leaf you will see a little black dot, and that is what we call a dormant node, and that is from where your flower would appear or your growth point would appear on your cutting. Now when you take a cutting, one must make sure that you have at least one of these nodes under the ground, so that's where your daughter plant will emerge from. If you don't have a node underground, your plant will never be able to produce a daughter plant, and then your plant will make ugly little rosettes that will come out on the vine, which is growing, which is not ideal. Then you will have to retake those cuttings and root them in order to get a normal rosetted growing plant. One of the very, very important things when you're taking a cutting is that you have to use a very good quality blade. Now this is actually one of the most important things when taking a cutting. Some things will improve your chances of a cutting striking, but some things are imperative when you're taking a cutting, and that would be a very good blade. Now I always use a blade with very good steel, something that's very, very sharp, and we're going to be taking multiple cuttings, so we want a blade that is durable. Now I find that bonsai knives are very, very good for cuttings, and they're good for any kind of cutting, so they last pretty long. So we've got a really nice cutting knife over here, and basically this is the one we're going to use with the plant. There are a couple of ways we can go about taking a cutting, depending on how many cuttings I want to take. If I wanted to take a cutting of this entire vine, I might cut it at the point that I want to, the part of the vine that I want to cut, and I would immediately start treating that cutting in the way that I'm going to show you ahead. But I'm going to take 2 cuttings off this plant right now, so we're going to take a cutting basically in the air right now, so we don't have to take the whole vine. When we cut the plants this way, we have to make sure which part of the cutting we want to keep, and then obviously we need to get rid of any excess leaves that are on the stem before we do take our cutting. So I want this tip of the plant to root, so basically we're going to use this little axle over here for our daughter plant to come out of, so I want to get rid of this leaf over here. After that leaf has been cut, we basically bring our piece of plastic ahead, and we want to make sure that if you're a youngster, you've got your parents watching you, because you don't want to wield a sharp knife without supervision. Okay, you're going to need a glass of water in order to take your cutting. This is also one of the things that will guarantee your cutting. The plants are all negatively pressurized, so the minute you take your cutting, the plant's going to start sucking air into it. So you really want to get the plant underwater as quickly as you can after you've cut it in order to stop that. It's called cavitation, and that's what we don't want. As we're taking our cutting, we want to take it at a 45-degree angle, so there's a lot more surface area for the cut. We want to get it underwater as quickly as we can, and that will prevent the cavitation. And that's basically your cutting that's almost ready to be put into its pot. Now there are a couple of other things you can do to guarantee or to improve the chances of success, and we'll go through that in a second. Okay, now that we have the rest of the vine here, we want to have 2 nodes. So of course we want to have a node underneath the ground where our daughter plant is going to come out from, and then we want at least 2 nodes above the ground so that there's enough leaf area for the plant to want to make a node make a node active, and enough nodes so that if one should fail, you had to have a second node where your plant will emerge from. So I decided in this cutting I want to give it a good chance of success. So I'm going to give it 3 nodes, and we're going to cut it over here. Once that cut has been taken, we put it immediately in the water. Now, to improve the chances that your cuttings will strike, we don't want to have too much surface area on the cutting. So we want to cut the leaves in half, and that will basically stop the plant from transpiring and actually letting off the moisture in the stem. So we're just going to cut it diagonally across the leaf. Make sure that all your leaves are cut, and this is your cutting. Now, since it's been in the water, it's sucked up the water into that cutting wound, and now it can't cavitate, and you basically will plant it immediately into your medium. Now, with Nepenthes cuttings, I personally never use a rooting hormone. With most other cuttings, hardwood cuttings, you certainly would use a rooting hormone or any other kinds of cutting. With Nepenthes, I have found in personal experience that they root much better without any kind of hormones. But a lot of people do use hormones, and it might speed up the time that a cutting would root in. Personally, I haven't had success, but you can try. Good rooting hormones would probably work. I just haven't had great success with it. I'm going to place our cutting into the medium. I'm going to make sure there's a really nice solid hole. We're going to use what we call a dibble stick in the trade. I'm going to take our cutting, and we're going to push it into that little hole, and we're going to make sure that our moss is nice and comfy tucked around our cutting. You can push it in there, compact it up a little bit. There we go. And there's your Nepenthes cutting. Now once we've got our cutting, everything is done, we're ready to go. Where are our plants going to stay? Now if you have a nice humid terrarium with lights in it, you could just put your cutting directly into there and your plant will root quite nicely in a nice humid terrarium. You should make sure that the humidity stays above 85 to 90% in order for success. Even up to 100% humidity, which is going to be difficult to achieve, but if you could get there, that would be good. But between 80 and 95% humidity is generally good for the success of cuttings. Now most people don't have a terrarium, so what we're going to use is the baggie method. So we'll just get ourselves a nice clear plastic bag, and you're going to have your plant inside that bag. Now of course we want to make sure that the cutting is totally inside the bag, so you're going to take a little bit of elastic band and tie your plant right into the bag like that. And there you go, you've got your cutting there. You're going to put it on a bright windowsill and your cutting will root very nicely there. If you've got some fluorescent lights and you want to put it under the fluorescent lights, that will also work quite well. With cuttings, one of the very important things to remember is to not to go around and start pulling on your plant to see if it is rooted. That's probably the worst thing you could do, because as the plant starts to root, they send out little filaments, and if you break the filaments, the plant will stop rooting. So basically don't touch the plant until it is started to grow again, or one of your dormant eyes has started to grow. If the plant has gone completely black, unfortunately the cutting has failed, and you can always try again. Well, that's about it for today for our Nepenthes cutting segment. I hope you've learned something today, and just always remember, if you have questions, you can go onto the internet, and there are many resources where you can get really good information. And if you're in South Africa, of course, you can get hold of Terry at Bonsai Tree, and he will give you all the information you require.